Mandukya Karika, Pranam Mantra. Om Bhadram Karnebhi Shrunuyam Deva Bhadram Pashe Maksha Bhirya Jatra Sthirairangaye Stustuvagam Sastanubhi Vyashema Deva Hitam Yadayuh Swasti na Indro Vriddhashava Swasti na Pusha Vishwaveda Swasti nastakshyo Arishtanemi Swasti no Brihas Patirdadhatu Om Shanti 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 Hari Om. So we have been covering Mandukya Karika, and unfortunately the speed is pretty slow, and every day, that is, whenever there is this talk, I plan to speed it up, but somehow it doesn't. Today we start with verse number 31. New concept is now introduced. It's concept of no mind, the state of no mind. Say, those of you who have studied Raj Yoga or have listened to Advaita here and there, you might have come across the term no mind. What exactly is no mind and why no mind? And what are the consequences of no mind? We will be discussing this. The Sanskrit term for Sanskrit word for it is Amanibhava. Man is mind. And when you add a, it implies no, not. Something like un in English, like worthy, unworthy. So just like when you add a, it negates the implications. Amanibhava. Those of you who are really curious about spiritual life and higher states of spiritual life, you would find these things pretty interesting, because every spiritual seeker has to go through this. And just to think, me, you, and all these names that I can see, Samir Panda, Rita Mishra, Lipika Guharai, Amit Rai Chaudhary, we all will have to go through this. Oh, and of course, there's Priyanka Bhattacharya, the good lady who is putting all these mantras and translations. We all will have to reach the state in this birth, in the next birth, or after 10 births, or after 1,000 births, after 1,000,000 births, whenever. We will have to reach this state. And even if you don't understand, like, oh, there is Abhishek Niyogi, he listens to my talks very sincerely and diligently. So he says he is also there. Yes, true. We have many listeners who have, oh, now everyone wants the name Dimple Singh and Ratna Banerjee. Anyway, I'm talking about every one of you. See, many listeners have written to me, or when they come to meet me, they say that they listen to Mandukya Karika talks, but they find it a bit difficult. Not because the subject is difficult, but because we have never got exposed to these ideas. I remember one very funny incident. When I was a young monk, that means I already had got my sannyas, that you get after 9 years in the Ramakrishna mission. It's a pretty long time. I was at a center, and there I persuaded 3, 4 monks, and I think 4 monks were there, and 3 of them were senior to me. And I persuaded them to have Mandukya Karika. One of us would read out Sanskrit, and the one would read out the English, and we would discuss what it means. So after 4 or 5 days, maybe we had covered 5, 7 pages. One of the very senior monks said, utter nonsense. It's a beautiful expression. He said, utter nonsense. After becoming monks, you don't have to study Mandukya Karika. Mandukya Karika should be studied before you become monks. The idea was, stop this. He himself was learned to some extent. And I always felt that he's one of those Vedantic monks who is kind of interested in renunciation. Mandukya Karika is for people who are ready to give up everything. So he found out a wonderful excuse. And that was, you should become monks after reading Mandukya Karika. Not that you should study Mandukya Karika after becoming monks. And that was the end of it. That was way back in 91, 92. 92 it was. So, but my dear audience, my dear listeners, more importantly, my adorable listeners, because indeed I salute to you that you have been listening to this series of talks so seriously. It's so difficult. People talk big about Advaita, but no, it's not that easy. Its ramifications, its implications, they're huge. Here we talk about the state of no mind. Manodrishyam idam dvaitam yat kinchit sacharacharam manaso hi manibhave dvaitam neva uplabhyate. In the earlier talk, it was explained that mind creates delusion, mind creates multiplicity. Oh, dear listeners, it's terrifying. In fact, Mandukya Karika will say this. It is terrifying. It's terrifying. The idea that this pen, this microphone, me, and this huge multiplicity before us. All this, everything that we see, is product of my mind. They don't have absolute existence. How terrifying. How terrifying. What this verse says, all these multiple objects comprising the movable and the immovable. That's a general expression they use in Sanskrit, Jada Chaitanya, are perceived by the mind alone. Mind alone perceives, not only perceives, it creates. For duality is never perceived when the mind ceases to act. Mind ceases to act under different conditions. Like when it ceases to act, we are not aware of it. But when we come out of it, we know that mind was not acting. Mind was not working. More importantly, there was no multiplicity. For example, in case of dream, we have multiplicity. When we close our eyes and think, there is multiplicity of thoughts. But there are conditions when the mind ceases to act. And we see there is no multiplicity. This discussion will continue. So it says that the premise, philosophical premise is that entire duality is mind is duality. Mind doesn't perceive duality as such. Mind is duality. Mind creates duality. So mind is duality. In the previous talk, we had used one possibility that how consciousness itself becomes mind and perceives the infinite as the multiplicity. Mind is multiplicity. I tell you, if you try to apply this in your daily life, even for a while, first thing is it gives you tremendous amount of peace. Initially, you will get scared. It's so frightening. Sri Ramakrishna had touched Narendranath Datta, Swami Vivekananda, later times, and he suddenly felt that entire everything, the room and everything was moving rapidly, circling rapidly, and everything was as if getting sucked into emptiness. Other than him, there was nothing else left. And he cried out in fear. He says, "What are you doing? I have father, I have mother." So two things were happening. Narendranath, as he was known in those days, his sense of I-ness was preserved. Everything else was vanishing. Now, this is the state where you really feel that, okay, multiplicity doesn't exist. But what we are discussing here in Mandukya Karika is where sense of I-ness also goes away. But when you're coming back to the state of mind, when you're coming back from that state of unification of whatever kind, back to multiplicity, first thing you become conscious of is I-ness. Those of you who have listened to my talks on Ishopanishad is there in English. It's also there in Bengali, Ishopanishad. You should listen to these talks. They're very good. It says, Tade jati, tannay jati, taddure tadvantike. It moves not. Anainat deva apnuvan purvamarsat. When Atman moved, even the gods, the senses, including mind, could not catch it. Why? Because see, when you think of yourself, say, I'm sitting here in Kolkata. Supposing I think of Delhi. I start thinking of Delhi. Now, before my mind reaches Delhi and I start thinking of Delhi, my I-ness reaches there. Unless my I-ness reaches there, I cannot think of Delhi. So Atman reaches there first. Mind reaches next. Dear listeners, it's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling that 7,000, 8,000 years ago, the sages, when level of education as we understand was nothing like what we have today. There was no communication as we have today. And see how in the depths of meditation, they had realized fundamental truths like Tade jati, tannai jati. It moves, yet it moves not. It is far, yet it is near. Even the gods cannot catch it. It runs faster. Why? As I explained. Here the premise is that duality and mind, these are same. Mind is duality. By duality we mean multiplicity. So the term they use is when you reach the state of no mind, you realize that there is no multiplicity. The state of no mind is reached via different methods. Acharya Shankara explains that when mind becomes concentrated, when mind becomes fully concentrated, how? Says term uses is through repeated practice and through discrimination, giving up, through renunciation. We will have to go slightly to yoga. And once again, my request is those of you who have not listened to our Raj Yoga talks, maybe either in English or in Bengali, should listen. Now, once you understand Raj Yoga, these phenomena can be understood quite easily. Raj Yoga talks about different states of mind: kshipt, vikshipt, mood, ekagra, niruddha. It is scattered, it's gathering, it's one pointed, etc. And finally, it is concentrated. Knowledge of Atman dawns only when your mind is concentrated. And the state of concentration is when it is chitta vritti nirodha. All the mental modifications, the modification of mind has to cease completely. And when it ceases completely, as we mentioned in the previous talk, as Sri Ramakrishna says, Shuddha Man, Shuddha Buddhi, Shuddha Atma, these are one. Mind, intellect, Atman, they all become one. To give you a very simple analogy, think of mind as a lake and the waves or ripples as vritti, function of the mind. Mind is mind only till it is functioning. That means till the time there are ripples, till the time there are waves in the mind, it is known as mind. The moment production of ripple, production of wave stops, you cannot call it mind anymore. Then what it is? Well, some of you might be curious. There's a pond of water and there are ripples. Ripples cease to exist. Will you say that there is no water? No, you cannot. So, no more wave. Interestingly, in Vedanta series, in Vedanta scriptures, they say it is no mind. It's the stoppage of vritti. It's the stoppage of mental waves. But the expression used is no mind. It's a very, very interesting thing. Very interesting thing. Why? Because when you go by the philosophy of yoga, in yoga, mind is a reality. Why? Because mind comes from prakriti, nature. And nature is a reality. It has an independent existence compared to consciousness, Atman. These are slightly technical, but since you people have been listening to our talks, and I'm sure you are interested in the philosophical implications, you'll find it very, very interesting. Very interesting. According to Sankhya philosophy and according to Yoga philosophy, Purush and Prakriti, consciousness and matter, they both have their individual realities. Prakriti is as real as Purush. So mind is as real as Purush. Real. But mind doesn't have the same powers as Purusha. So it's a different thing. But in Vedanta, there is only Purusha. In Vedanta, there is only Atman. So if mind stops functioning, is no more mind. This idea will be explained later. So, what this verse is saying that when you practice renunciation, when you practice discrimination, that is Gyan Yoga. Discrimination is when you say, this is consciousness and this is matter. This belongs to the realm of matter and I'll give it up. And when you're continuously into it, practicing, you reach that state where you see only oneness. There's no more multiplicity. And this happens in deep sleep too. When you go to deep sleep, mind becomes functionless. When you get up, you suddenly become disoriented. Where I am? Or sometimes when you become unconscious, murcha, whether that be drug induced or be because of some malfunctioning of your mind, not mind, brain stops taking the mind. So we are not aware of what's happening. During those moments too, multiplicity ceases to exist. So this is the example that our Advaitins use to counter this. The dualists say that, so even after your nirvikalpa samadhi, you have to come back to the state of mind. So mind is a reality. Now we are not going into all that detail because see, they are great scholars. Many of them are great sages. Who we are to contradict them? We are studying a subject, we'll focus only on that. So, manaso hi Amanibhave dvaitam naiva uplabhyate. It's a very beautiful thing. Whenever mind becomes no mind, there is no multiplicity. And two examples they use. One is of deep sleep. Third, we are adding the state of unconsciousness and the state of samadhi, where you have labored hard, where you have worked extremely hard to reach the state where there is a complete cessation of mind waves. And this has been achieved by many sages. And that is the goal of life. In all these three cases, we find that mind stops working. The moment mind stops working, that means we don't have remembrance. And so consequence is multiplicity ceases to act. Time to be doubtful. Time to be doubtful of our multiplicity, the idea of multiplicity. So what's the practical use of it? Nowadays, we like to know what's the practical use, extreme practical use. Whenever you are assailed by very powerful emotions, and when you have very powerful disturbances, either good or bad, if you can bring in this philosophy, is that see, ultimately everything is unified. The person who is hurting me, that person is no one other than me, myself, because there is complete unification. And the person who is giving me joy, extreme joy, person to whom I am feeling grateful, extreme grateful, and we are ready to do anything for that person. Ultimately, that person is only me. One day I was talking to one of my brother monks. He's an extremely scholarly person, extremely. Our Dhyan Gamyananda, he takes talks on Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. He's a very learned person. And we're discussing about bhakti. And from there, we're discussing obstacles in bhakti and steps in bhakti, how a devotee progresses and how he feels that he's progressing. So then he said beautifully that, see, by his very orientation, he's a devotee. Of course, he's an extremely scholarly person. And yet he's a computer man, he's PhD in computers. So he laughed and he said, Swamiji, isn't it so funny that every kind of progress that we make in Karma Yoga or in Raj Yoga or in Gyan Yoga, whatever it be, ultimately it is all because of Advait only. The idea that there is multiplicity, there is God, and I am moving towards God. Like people who say, oh, it was all destined. People say, it was all God's will. What do you mean by God's will? Do you mean to say that God is there, somebody sitting up and controlling things and planning things for you? How stupid! Stupid with a special stress on top. You alone exist. Who is there to control your destiny? No law of karma works on you. How can law of karma work on you? You are master of all karma. Once I had met one astrologer, and he was good. Astrologer was good. So I showed him my palm, just out of curiosity, it's part of fun. And he very seriously told me, very seriously, Swamiji, this palmistry and horoscope, etc., do not work in the case of monks. I was very young. I got curious. I asked, how? He said, look, anyone who has given up the world, anyone who has become a monk, he's now kind of connected with God. And God is the master of all these planets. As far as normal people are concerned, normal people, even devotees, are high grade devotees. For them, planets are highly effective. But for monks, they are effective and they may not be effective. So it becomes extremely unpredictable. Extremely unpredictable. Why? But ordinary people remain captive, and ordinary people are controlled by various forces. But those who are trying to feel their identity with God, even amongst you, who can control you? There is complete oneness. Whether you attain that oneness through bhakti or you attain that through Vedanta, it doesn't matter. It's ultimately about oneness. So, how do you reach that state of no mind? It's good to talk about destruction of multiplicity. What about how do you reach that? It's verse number 32. Atma satya anubodhena na sankalpayate yada amanastam tadayati grahya bhave tadagraham. Is translated, it reads, when the mind, after realizing the knowledge that Atman alone is real, once you realize that Atman alone is real, becomes free from imaginations, that is multiplicity, and therefore does not cognize anything for want of objects to be cognized, it ceases to be the mind. It's English translation I'm borrowing, but it may not be clear to you. We will explain. We all have heard of Samadhi. We all have heard of Advaita. And we have heard of Shankaracharya. And we have heard of Sri Ramakrishna. When they reach that state, they realize there is only pure consciousness. What exactly happens in that pure consciousness? When you reach that pure state of consciousness, you realize that subject, object, and the action, the verb, their multiplicity ceases. Now, what is multiplicity? There is the subject. Here is me, and here is this pen, and I am looking at this pen. So three things are involved: subject, object, verb. But when you go for self-knowledge, when you realize self, what happens? All these three become pure consciousness. This triad ceases to exist. Now, subject is Atman. Object also is Atman. Now, what will that person crave for? Think of, say, Sri Ramakrishna. Most of you know about Sri Ramakrishna. So Sri Ramakrishna realizes reaches that state where he realizes that Atman alone is real, nothing else is there other than Atman. Now, the food that he is taking, it actually happened with Swami Vivekananda. He was still Narendranath Datta, and once he was making fun of Sri Ramakrishna with someone, telling that he was ridiculing the idea of Advaita. And Sri Ramakrishna, when he heard, he just touched him. And once he touched him, Narendranath went to that state where he saw everything is conscious. When he returned home, he couldn't eat. Why? He was seeing the food as conscious. There is that lake at Hedua, North Kolkata, where now we have Swamiji's ancestral house. And there are iron railings. He went and banged his head against those railings to see whether or not the railings existed, because he was seeing them as purely conscious. He had head injury and still he could feel that it was conscious. This is what happens with persons who reach the state of non-dual. What? When they are acting, when they are working, they very well know that person whom they are teaching, they are Brahman, they are Atman. And the process, that is also Atman. And the ultimate goal is Atman. How it is effective for us, how it is useful for us, well, we can always practice it. Most of the things that we discuss here, I learned from Srimad Swami Mokshadanandaji Maharaj. He used to be my acharya, teacher, when I was in training center. Like every young monk, every novice has to stay at Belur Math for 2 years in the early days. So he was my acharya, and then I kind of bonded with him. And for next 25 years, I used to come to him regularly. And whenever I come, I used to spend 1 or 2 hours. And then there was a time when I was at Belur Math for a very long period, and I used to spend 3-4 hours with him. And he had told me exactly this, that if you start practicing Advaita, just by reading these books, you start practicing. That means you try to feel that oneness. And if your life really goes to that state where it's pure consciousness, that means when there is no one whom you want to grab and there is no one whom you want to reject, says, for all practical purposes, you are now a Brahmagyani. You have reached that state of Jnana. Vijnana remains. And what is that Vijnana? When you actually see it, somebody has written of Vijnana Vedanta. It's utter nonsense. Jnana Vijnana, it's a very old thing for us Hindus. And what is that? Jnana is when you theoretically know it and practice it, even practice it fully. However, you do not know it. You have not realized it. You have visualized it. You have practicalized it, but not yet realized. There have been cases when someone was extremely good at theory, extremely good. Like there are very good students of physics who know everything about atomic bomb, even the practical aspect, without ever having seen any of those instruments. It happens. Sometimes if you are fascinated by the Himalayas, say, you might study a lot about the Himalayas so thoroughly, you know everything about the Himalayas, but you have never been to that place. And when you go there, you see, oh, exactly, it's like this. Atmagyan, self-knowledge, Advaita is something like that. Theoretically, you know it. You practice it in your daily life. Someday you realize it. And then you'll find that what you are doing it as a matter of practice, that's the reality. I grew up in a village, And people there were extremely religious. When I look back at their practices, I find that they were doing things which highest of Hindu scriptures prescribe. They did not know of those things. They were doing it mechanically. And that's how they were holding on to their religion and carrying on the practices. When I started studying these scriptures, I realized, oh my God, these things are coming from historical past. Agni Mide Purohitam. And the practice of putting something cooked in the fire is practiced practically everywhere. Now, people who practice these things, they do not know. And I personally have come across hundreds of people who who have the highest respect for fire, highest respect as divine being, as God. In those days, I did not know that our Ved begins with Agni Mide Purohitam, worship of Agni. Same with Advaita, it's same, absolutely same. People who practice bhakti, absolutely same. When a great saint realizes that God has become everything, he says certain things, and we people, we are ordinary people, we listen to these greats. Acharya Shankar very beautifully describes what is spiritual practice. Says the practices of the spiritually perfect, when done consciously with labor, is sadhana. So, for example, Sri Ramakrishna or Swami Vivekananda or Shankaracharya or any of the great Advaitins whom we have heard of, they did certain things naturally because they saw like that. You might have seen kids trying to act like their parents. They try to talk and walk like their parents. They like to sit, they like to pose. Just like that. Spiritual practices are just that. You have read the biography of Sri Ramakrishna. You have read the biography of, say, Shankaracharya or whomsoever you respect. And then you try to put yourself in that mold. Someday, when you realize the ultimate truth, nothing new comes to your life. Dear listeners, a word of caution, a word of caution. Many of those who are into spiritual life, some of you might be, you think that it's some kind of sudden conversion. The idea of sudden conversion implies that you are living one kind of life and you are doing maybe some meditation, some japam, some worship, and one fine day you will suddenly have vision of God. You will have some vision of God and your life will change forever. No, it doesn't work like that. It might have happened with one or two persons, but no, that's not the rule. What happens is you accept the truth of whatever you want to. Say, for example, you want to be an Advaitin. You take up the reality of Advait, start practicing it. Those of you who have read about how crystallization takes place might know that it's a saturated solution. There is a super saturated solution. And finally, a crystal comes from outside and this formation of crystal. Spiritual realization happens like this. For nearly every spiritual practitioner, for nearly every, there are one or two exceptions, but they're exceptions. They're the masters. If you are serious about spiritual life, first you decide what kind of realization you want. Do you want Advait or do you want Bhakti? Fine. You want Bhakti, let's say. You want to feel that Krishna has become everything. Now treat the world accordingly. Krishna alone has become everything. And you become fully established in it, fully established in it. Anyone who is committing some kind of mischief, you think it's naughty Krishna. So, like we have in description in Bhagavata where when Krishna is acting naughty. And when Krishna is acting naughty, his mother Yashoda punishes him, ties him to ties him with a rope. So these things will happen. Not that you are not supposed to all those things. You can. But mind it, when the final realization comes, it is just vetting of the practices that you have been doing. So anyway, Atma Satya Anubodhena na sankalpayate yadha amanastam tada yati grahya bhave tadagram. When you see everything as Atman, what is there to grab? And what is there to give up? Nothing. Nothing. Whenever there is cognition, when we talk about cognition, experiencing something, there has to be duality. Now you have reached the state of non-duality. How can there be any kind of cognition? Since there is no cognition, there is no mind. Object itself being Atman, nothing is left to be done. And this is the state of money, no mind. Now the first term here is Atma Satya Anubodhena. When the mind realizes the truth regarding Atman, regarding self, Acharya Shankar very beautifully says that what the scriptures have said, what your teachers have said, teachers who have been brought up in the tradition of Advaita, and finally when you realize by yourself, Shruti, Yukti, Anubhuti, the three things, you have read it in the scriptures, you have reasoned it with your teacher, and you realize it yourself. The three conditions of truth. Shruti, Yukti, Anubhuti. When the teacher teaches, he doesn't impose some truth on you. He tells a statement, and then there is a conversation. And because in that conversation you can object, but that objection is for the purpose of learning, not for contradicting the teacher. Slowly, your mind gets established. It gets fully established in the truth. You start practicing that kind of life. When we say that he's a religious person, it means that the spiritual truths have been imbibed by him and he's now leading the life accordingly. These people from young generation who have no mooring, practically they have no mooring. They talk about, I'm spiritual, I'm not religious. I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. My God, what statement. Sri Ramakrishna was like that. He was spiritual, he was no more religious because he had transcended that state of practices, spiritual practices. My God, these teenagers, they have reached the state of Sri Ramakrishna and Jesus Christ. They don't even understand what they say. So once I met one lady, she was pretty learned and all, and she said, "Oh, Swamiji, I'm spiritual and I'm not religious." I said, "My God, then I will have to fall flat at your feet because this is the state of greatest of masters." When the spiritual truth is practiced in daily life, you become a religious person. But when spirituality dawns upon you and you finally see everything as God, what kind of rituals you will follow? No, you don't have to. Our listeners, if not all of you, some of you must have some weaknesses. Like when we were young kids, we had love for sugar candies, we had love for chocolates. And those shopkeepers, they're so mischievous. They would keep those sugar candies, etc., in the front. And when we passed through that street, our eyes would always fall on that. And we would be so tempted. And we always thought, oh, if only we had some money, we would purchase that. Just like that, all of you must have some kind of weakness for something, for getting books, purchasing books, for painting. I mean, in the sense of acquiring ornaments, whatever, cars. If you have those kind of desires, you desire to go somewhere, and supposing you become master of all those things, you are now rich enough to purchase any kind of ornament. So initially you have some desire and then you get that ornament, and now your house is full of ornaments. You have a huge storehouse of ornaments. And you have a fleet of cars or whatever it is. Will you be desiring for anything anymore? No, you will not be. You already have it. Same thing happens. Absolutely the same thing happens when you are established in Advaita. Everything is Brahman. And because everything is Brahman, what will you want to have for yourself? Nothing. Mind has now ceased to exist. This is the state of no mind. So, the state of no mind is reached only through knowledge. It's only through knowledge. Knowledge of Atman, self-knowledge. How to get it? Kalpakamajam jnanam geya abhinnam prachakshate. Brahma geyam ajam nityam ajenajam vibudhyate. This idea we had mentioned earlier. Knowledge, that is Brahman. It is unborn, it's free from imagination, any kind of duality. Is described by the wise as ever inseparable from the knowable. Immutable and birthless Brahman is the goal of knowledge. The birthless is known by the birthless. Knowledge, the term is cognition. When I perceive something, like I'm looking at this microphone, this is cognition. When I know this, we call it knowledge. But this kind of worldly knowledge, it involves the duality of subject and object. And there's this process of knowing. But knowing Brahman is not that kind of knowing Brahman. Very often people talk about Ishwar Gyan, Ishwar Darshan. People talk about Brahma Gyan, Brahma Darshan. No, it's not. It's not that you are something and Brahman is something and you see Brahman. It's not that you are something and Brahman is something and you get the knowledge of Brahman. No, it's not like that. Then what it is? Knowledge and Brahman, these are two same thing. Because if these were not two, then it will be implied that there is knowledge which is reaching Brahman and covering it. But every kind of knowledge, that is process of knowledge coming from mind, is extremely, extremely, extremely small compared to that huge Brahman. It cannot grasp. Sri Ramakrishna put it very simply. If you have a pot of 1 liter, you cannot put 3 liters of milk into it. Brahman is infinite, mind is finite. So every time the term Brahma Gyan or Gyan, normally when scriptures talk about Gyan, they mean knowledge of Brahman. So Gyan and Brahma, these are same. Whether you say knowledge, or you say knowledge of Brahman or you say Brahman, these three are one and the same. And that Brahman is unborn. The knowledge is unborn. Whatever is the trait of Brahman is the trait of knowledge. Says, if knowledge were not Brahman, in that case, it would be something like trying to see light with darkness. Mind is limited. Knowledge itself, the knowledge of the world belongs to mind, is some kind of agyan only, some kind of ignorance. So you are trying to see knowledge with some kind of ignorance. You are trying to look at light with the help of darkness. Can you see light with the help of darkness? No, you cannot. Nor can you see darkness with light. That's why we cannot know Maya. Neither Brahman can be known nor Maya can be known. That's a very interesting thing. Because Maya does not exist. And knowledge itself is Brahman. So Brahman has the quality. It is neither born nor it dies, nor it has any kind of qualification, nor it has any kind of quality, nor does it undergo any kind of transformation. One who knows Brahman, anyone who knows Brahman, like there are stories about Ramana Maharshi, he knew Brahman. So when, say for example, they teach with the full knowledge that the doer and the deed itself and the result, all these are one. That is Brahman. The, as I say, take home salary, take home knowledge for today's talk. No mind, whenever we are talking about no mind, it can be attained only in the state of Brahmagyan. What is the state of Brahmagyan? Brahmagyan is when you realize Brahman. That's why the term often used is realization. Why realization? Because Gyan and Brahma, they are same. So it says, Brahman is unborn. Knowledge is unborn. And these two are one and the same. And when you know the birthless, that is Brahman, with the birthless, which is Jnana, such a beautiful. Brahma Geyam Ajam Nityam, Ajenajam Vibudhyate. Ajena Ajam Vibudhyate. The birthless is known by the birthless. Mind is born, mind grows. We have been acquiring knowledge. My mind is improving every day. Your mind is improving every day. So your mind is undergoing transformation. It had a birth, it will die. So it belongs to a different class. In this kind of knowledge, intercaste marriages are not permitted. In our society, we permit it. Not there. Brahman belongs to a different class. And what's that? Unborn. If you have to know it, you have to know it through the knowledge which is unborn. Oh, such a phenomenal thing. So difficult to grasp. The mind, the working of mind, the process of knowledge that works through mind is born. We didn't have a knowledge of something, and then that knowledge came. So knowledge is born. But here, spiritual knowledge, knowledge of Brahman, it remains unborn ever, ever. Yes, Rajiv Chattaraj writes, Gyata, Geya, Gyan. They're all one. There is no two. So how can you have a knower? There is no two. How can there be the process of knowing? Not only this, the great ones who preach. So when Ramana Maharshi was preaching, he knew it very well that person who is listening, he is also Brahman. The act of preaching is Brahman. The act of preaching is Brahman. Act of preaching is Brahman. Mind it. The act also is Brahman. Brahma, and this is what has been said. Brahmarpanam Brahmavi Brahmagno Brahmanautam in 4th chapter of Gita. Everything is Brahman. The act is also Brahman. It's so difficult to grasp. Nevertheless, this is the truth. And the result, Brahmaivatena Gantabhyam. The result is Brahman. The doer is Brahman, the object is Brahman, the act is Brahman, and the result is Brahman. Since this knowledge is always manifest, self-evident. It doesn't require any other kind of knowledge. For example, we have sun. When the sun comes out, it doesn't require any other kind of light. It doesn't require any kind of light to see that sun has come out. So luminous, self-luminous. Similarly, Brahmagyan is self-luminous. It doesn't require any other method of knowledge. And hence, it doesn't require any other instrument of knowledge. And hence, mind is an obstruction. Forget about that mind is not needed. Mind is an obstruction. So well. Then is verse 34. Nigrihitasya manuso nirvikalpasya dhimataha prachara satu vigyeya shushupte anyo na tatsamaha. Well, whatever we have been discussing, isn't it similar to Shushupti, deep sleep? Some of our listeners had raised this question. What about deep sleep? Is deep sleep same as Atma Gyan? No, it is not. Is deep sleep Shushupti as Atma? No, no. There's a fundamental difference between deep sleep and Atma Gyan. In both the cases, mind stops working. In both the cases, multiplicity ceases to exist. Yet, these are fundamentally different. Our time is up. We'll take it up in the next talk. How Samadhi is different from Shushupti. Samadhi versus Shushupti. Thank you so much. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Shri Ramakrishna.